Nice turnout. I just want to say, really looking forward to this cuddle puddle. This is going to be phenomenal. So I don't know what you guys are here for, but you know the topic of today's discussion. But no, in all seriousness, the topic of our panel is going to be a figure who may go down in history as more controversial than Cleopatra, Queen Victoria, or even Kim Kardashian. And that person is someone who goes by the name of Molly. You may have heard of her. The Reagans hated her. Rick Doblin can't seem to get enough of her. But having started school as the kid who got bullied or ostracized for decades, I think it's safe to say that Molly is now hitting her stride and has achieved cool kid status. If you were to ask a chemist her legal name, they'd call her 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine. Some of you may have heard of her by her nicknames like Ecstasy, E, X, or when I Googled around, some people even call her Adams or Beans, but I think they're taking a little too much Molly. But many of us just call her by her acronym, MDMA. And she's certainly captivated our attention because that's what this panel is here to discuss. Her history, how she works, the promises she holds, as well as the potential pitfalls. So without further ado, I think we're in for a round of introductions. Real quickly, this is the most you'll hear from me, but my name is Tim Schlitz. I'll be moderating this panel. And a little bit of my background, I'm a partner and co-founder alongside my business partner, Daniel Goldberg, who's in the audience, as well as my colleague, Adrian Joe, who will be doing a panel tomorrow at a venture capital fund called Palo Santo. We invest in the psychedelic therapeutic space, and our focus is on expanding access to accessible, like I mentioned, affordable and safe psychedelic therapies. So enough of me. I'll turn it over to our esteemed panelists. And Rachel, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off.
Absolutely. My name is Rachel Newer. I'm a freelance science journalist and author. I spent the first half of my career writing about conservation, wildlife ecology, but I have pivoted to psychedelic science. I recently wrote a book called I Feel Love, MDMA, and the Quest for Connection in a Fractured World. Julie.
Hi, my name's Julie Holland. I'm a psychiatrist, medical monitor for some of the early MDMA PTSD studies, early adopter of feeling that MDMA could be useful into the field of psychiatry. It's one of the things that really got me to go to med school. Rachel's book I really thought was great. I edited a book in 2001 called Ecstasy, The Complete Guide. And all proceeds from that book help to fund clinical research. And I'm a harm reductionist and a musician and just very dedicated to enabling MDMA-assisted therapy to work its way through into psychiatry and beyond. Our medical system needs rejiggering, and I think that ultimately this could be helpful.
Hey everybody, I'm Matt Baggett. I'm a neuroscientist and a drug developer. I have been studying MDMA in non-clinical and clinical ways since the late 1980s. I had the honor of having a chapter in Julie's book she mentioned. And I'm currently CEO of Tactogen, which is a public benefit corporation that's working to develop next generation MDMA-like molecules, which we hope will be gentler and more accessible to more people. And I'm really thrilled to be up here with this great group of panelists.
Thanks, guys. So before I dive into kind of a more in-depth and nuanced discussion, I just want to set a historical and cultural context. And I'll turn to you first, Rachel, since you've done a lot of great writing on this around MDMA. But I think a lot of us know of MDMA and its initial surge in the 80s and kind of the party drug reputation. But can you give the audience some more color on kind of MDMA's long history, when it was first synthesized, sort of its early history? Give us more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. As Tim said, my first introduction to MDMA was Ecstasy, holes in the brain, 90s dare kid. But what a lot of people don't know is that MDMA is actually over a century old. Its story originally starts on Christmas Eve, 1912, when the German pharmaceutical company Merck filed a patent for MDMA. And they weren't looking for some kind of mind-altering party drug. They were looking for a blood-clotting agent. And MDMA was just a chemical intermediary on the steps along that process. Whether or not Merck scientists ever found out about MDMA's very special properties, we don't know. There's hints in their archives that perhaps they did, but when I tried to reach out to Merck to get more information, they stopped responding to my emails. So very fishy indeed, but that's a mystery that some archivist who speaks German will have to figure out. The next time that MDMA pops up in the historical record of note is the 1950s during an exceptionally shameful chapter of American history when the CIA and the Army were trying to search for a chemical truth serum, something they could use to control enemy minds, either on an individual basis or just spraying it across a population and owning the Soviets or North Koreans. We know that MDMA was on the list of the U.S. Army's substances of interest. What we do not know is whether the Army ever wound up giving it to a subject, whether a soldier or a mental health patient, covertly, without their consent, or with their consent. There's tantalizing hints of this. I spoke with a doctoral student named Nicholas Denome who was really obsessed with finding the answer to this question. He got much further in the Freedom of Information Act request process than I did, and he wound up finding a document that suggested that MDMA might have been given to mental health patients at Tulane University in New Orleans in the 1950s. But when he went to the Inspector General's office with this very, very specific citation, they said, oh, we can't find that document. So again, fishy, we don't know. The next time MDMA really pops up is in the 1970s when a student of the psychedelic chemist Alexander Shulgin resynthesized MDMA at UC Berkeley in the summer of 1975. And this student, his name was Karl Resnikoff, and his girlfriend Judith Gips wound up being the first people by name that we know of who took MDMA. Now, certainly people had taken it before, there's hints of this, but Carl and Judith are the ones we know, certainly, and they did so on a ferry from San Francisco to Sausalito on a beautiful September afternoon.
Nice. For the Tulane students, if that is true, that might be the funnest homework assignment in history.
What year was that, 75?
Summer of 75.
Okay, but what we also know is that 1971, there was MDMA on the streets.
Exactly. So we do know that chemists were making MDMA based on seizures, but that police were making of what they thought was the related compound MDA. But MDA had just been banned by the Controlled Substances Act in 1970. So smart chemists were just sticking this methyl group onto MDA, or so goes the reasoning, to make a legal loophole with MDMA. But we don't know who those chemists were or who their customers were, unless that was you, Julie.
I was born in 65, so I'm not going to take credit for that. But I feel like that was a Dave Nichols paper, the 71. He's a chemist who actually wrote the chemistry chapter for my original book and made the MDMA for the MAP studies. So are you going to continue from 75 on?
I think I was just supposed to take us to 75. Do you want to?
Can I take us from 75?
Start,
okay, great. So when I was 10, no. We're going to flash forward like a decade, basically, because there wasn't really... what was going on in the 70s is that there were therapists slowly working underground, giving MDMA to their patients during psychotherapy and finding that it was a good catalyst in making the therapy go deeper and be a little bit easier, get a little bit deeper, much faster. And like any good sort of chemical catalyst, there's an equation that's already going on. You're just kind of pushing it through. More intensity, more heat, more efficiency, and I would also argue more effective than regular psychotherapy. So Leo Zeff, who is sort of one of the major Johnny Appleseeds when it comes to MDMA-assisted therapy, he was working in the late 70s and through the 80s, giving MDMA to therapists who were giving it to their patients. So he really magnified some of the early anecdotal experiences. A lot of people had it as couples therapy, or Bob Forty, I know, was involved in group MDMA therapy. Phil Wolfson was involved in family MDMA therapy. So there was a lot of underground work going on. And, any clinical work really is sort of standing on the shoulders of the giants of the underground people who, God bless them, are still working today because there's obviously more of a demand than a supply at the moment. So 85, but you want to talk about the Texas story, so I will paint the picture. So there's a lot of underground work, and eventually some people are not taking it with their therapists. They're actually taking it in recreational settings, including in bars and nightclubs and things like that. But I will let Rachel give the details for that. But where I came in, which is the part that matters, I was a sophomore at Penn, pre-med, studying psychopharmacology, and there was a new drug that I heard about, and I was very excited because I had tried all the other ones, and in 85, there really weren't that many drugs to try. So the fact that there was a new drug, I was already thrilled about, but the fact that this was a drug that was being used in the context of psychotherapy, I'm like, this is perfect for me. This is exactly what, I want to be a psychiatrist. I'm a psychonaut. This is great. So I got in touch with a bunch of people who were involved in the early sort of media in 1985. I talked to Lester Grinspoon. May his memory be a blessing. And he was very involved early on. And they were calling it Adam back then, by the way. So, and I also called Rick Doblin and had a lovely conversation with him and continued to be in touch with him. And basically everybody that I talked to on the phone that summer, 85, I assigned a chapter for the book that I wanted to write about MDMA. Rick Doblin and I took MDMA together the last day that it was legal, before it was made illegal, I should say, because there was this period of time where it wasn't yet a Schedule I drug. Not the same as legal, but it wasn't illegal, it wasn't scheduled. And that all changed June 1st, 1985, I believe. So if I'm not mistaken, that means Rick and I there's like a May 31st got together. And if you ever heard the story about Rick's printing become more than a dream because his printer had a tab of acid in it, that was not my acid, but I was with Rick and I still have the printout to the highest bidder. It's in my basement. I keep thinking I should frame it, but I haven't gotten around to it. Anyway, why don't you talk about Texas, because I think that may be interesting to some people here.
Yeah, we are in Texas, so let's talk about Texas. So in the late 70s, early 80s, there was this interesting tension that was emerging in the community. There were the Julie types, the therapists, who, let's do this with our friends and let's, raise humanity up. That's great. But there were also the party contingent. And oftentimes the party contingent wanted to also make money pushing MDMA out to the masses. And of all the recreational dealers that emerged at this time, one name stood out above them all, and that was Michael Clegg. And Michael Clegg ran what came to be known as the Texas Group, because a number of their associates were headquartered out of Dallas. Dallas, at the time, also happened to be home of one of the hottest nightclubs in the world, the Start Club. On opening night, Stevie Nicks and Grace Jones opened. Everyone from George W. Bush to Tom Cruise came through. It was just this temple of hedonism and party. I mean, I wish I could go back in time. But the lubricant at the Start Club wasn't alcohol. It was MDMA. It had come down from New York City and just greased the wheels of the Start Club and quickly spread to Dallas and to Texas more broadly. And as Julie was saying, this was a time when MDMA wasn't legal, but it wasn't illegal. And for a lot of Texans, this was the permission that they needed to do MDMA. It was like alcohol, like tobacco. It was a drug that was socially okay because it was legal. So you had Southern Methodist University students doing it. You had the so-called flash and trash kids in Dallas doing it. So it really just kicked things off at the Start Club. Okay, so Michael Clegg is pushing out this ecstasy at the Start Club. He's kind of building this empire on the West Coast, Texas, the Northeast. And this is what attracted the attention of the DEA, which ultimately moved to schedule MDMA in 1985. I'm actually curious, did anyone here try any Michael Clegg ecstasy? Okay, anyway. And has anyone been to the Start Club? Yes, nice. All right, I want to hear the stories after.
Yeah, get up on stage.
It's sad, but yeah, I know. Come up here, gentlemen. Yeah. No, it was shut down. There was a big drug raid, but it also coincided with things like the AIDS epidemic, with the economic crash in Dallas. So sadly, the Start Club closed its doors.
So Senator Lloyd Bentsen sort of caught wind of the Texas situation, brought it to DEA. They proposed emergent scheduling. They were just going to go ahead and put it in Schedule 1 without too much ado. But we needed more ado. And so Rick Doblin sort of got a bunch of people together and sued the DEA to get it scheduled in a different category, basically. And there were trials, there were hearings, there was testimony. It went on for days and days. And the DEA administrative law judge, Francis Young, said, "You're right, it should be Schedule 3. That's what makes the most sense. That way there can be research." And the DEA said, "Thank you, DEA administrative law judge, for your opinion, but we're just going to go ahead and keep it in Schedule 1. And that's actually happened quite a few times over the past few decades, where somebody from the DEA listens to all the testimony and says, "Yeah, it should be Schedule 3. They said that with cannabis." DEA said, "Thank you for," I don't know what the administrative law judges are doing with the DEA, but they don't seem to have a lot of influence over what actually happens at DEA. So, and then you have the whole kind of rave scene, which we can gloss over, but the one thing I will say about the rave scene is that it was really fun, and it got me really thinking about community and how magical it feels to be with a group of people who are all doing the same thing at the same time and feeling good about it.
I just want, did George W. Bush do MDMA? That's what I want to know. Or was it George H.W. Bush while he was vice president? That
Sir, did he do it? I wasn't there, I can't tell you.
Do we have any records? Yeah. So we've hit a lot on kind of MDMA as a party drug, and it's, you know, developed that reputation in many circles for better or for worse. But Julie, I want to get into MDMA's therapeutic promise. I mean, you hit on how therapists have used it, but what is the clinical data guiding us towards? I mean, we have, you know, it's about to get approved for something.
Right. I mean, the clinical data are very strong and sort of hard to argue with. The power is very strong. The people who go through the protocol of MDMA-assisted therapy for the purpose of treating post-traumatic stress disorder, by the end of the study, about 2/3 of people don't really qualify for a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder anymore. So in any other field of medicine, you'd be like, oh, we cured about 2/3 of people, but psychiatry, we don't like to use the word cure very often, but people aren't meeting criteria for their diagnosis anymore. That's really something. So people are getting better, stop using some of the medicines they were using before. That's one patient category that seems very clear. And by the way, keep in mind that a lot of us have been traumatized over the last several years of existence. And many of us probably qualify to some degree for post-traumatic stress disorder. But these clinical studies were done on people who were severely, and in some cases had like complex PTSD, chronic PTSD, PTSD that did not respond to other treatments. The efficacy, I think, is pretty strongly there. There may be other clinical indications. I mean, one of the things that I say is anything that can get better with psychotherapy can potentially get better more quickly and more efficiently with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. So that's almost anything. But there are particular pockets of patient populations where there are clinical research protocols happening, or where there have been social anxiety in adults with autism was one study that already happened, and I'm hoping that there will be more autism studies. Planned right now is MDMA therapy for people with schizophrenia. It is very early stages, early days, but I'm thrilled to even say that out loud in the crowd, because the very first time I took MDMA, which actually wasn't with Rick, but by myself, and a notebook and a pen, which is how I always like to take drugs the first time I do them, one of the things I noticed was how incredibly quiet my head was. And one of my earliest thoughts, the first time I had MDMA, was like, oh my God, how amazing would this be for somebody who's, has voices, or they've got a lot of really loud thoughts, just to have some quiet and some peace for a few hours. So there's two top researchers in the United States, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast. They're both designing MDMA studies for people with schizophrenia. And at first it seemed like it was a little bit competitive, and now it seems like it's very collaborative, which makes me happy. So that is a whole other area. But treatment-resistant depression is possible. I think addictions in general. I mean, anything that makes you sort of have more flexible thinking or be more open to looking at your pathology and seeing the narrative of where it came from and why it emerged, and whether it's really helping you now. Anything where you can look at that narrative. So gambling, alcoholism, drug addiction, domestic violence. But the overarching thing is really trauma processing. And, there's just a study came out like yesterday about how the diagnostic categories are kind of BS in psychiatry. And a lot of it really just comes down to childhood trauma, other traumas. So anything you can do to process your trauma and sort of clear the way, as long as you're full, you can't really receive anything. And so to some degree, it's kind of like house cleaning, that you're going on an archaeological dig, you're seeing where you got hurt, you're pulling out these sort of malignant things that need to be pulled out, need to be examined, but you're comfortable with the process of the examination. Many people know that psychotherapy is uncomfortable at times, and it's often 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or you really get to something that's uncomfortable, and then you can't find your patient for a while because they're kind of sealed over and can't deal with it. So in some ways, it's a little bit like adding anesthesia to surgery. It allows you to really do the work more thoroughly without as much pain.
Julie, can you do drugs alone since you're a practicing psychiatrist? Are you your own therapist? Is this like a 2-for-1 deal? Is that how it works?
Don't do what I do what I tell you to do.
No, I know. Matt, I'm gonna turn to you, give you some airtime here. So we kind of hit on MDMA's clinical effects, kind of at a higher level, but let's get a little more reductionist and talk about MDMA's mechanism of action. So as a PhD in neuroscience, I think you're perfect to turn to here on the pharmacology involved, and then even building up to some of the neural circuitry involved. If you don't mind hitting on why MDMA is so different from classic psychedelics as well.
Sure, yeah. Before I do that, though, I want to kind of add on to what Julie just said, which is if you think about MDMA as a treatment in conjunction with psychotherapy for helping people with post-traumatic stress disorder, you might think, okay, that's like 3.6% of the population, and maybe we'll be able to diagnose more people once we have an effective treatment, and it'll end up being a higher number. But if you start adding on all these other potential indications where we have some signal, so for example, substance abuse problems, we have an open label trial with alcohol use disorder where MDMA seemed to help. And in the participants in the PTSD studies, we also saw a decrease in problem drinking. We also saw improvements in eating disorders in that same trial as well. And there's anecdotes about people being cured of specific phobias, and that's something that affects about 9% of the public. Social anxiety, that's like 7% of the public. And so if you start to add this all up, it gets to be at least 1 in 4 people is potentially going to be helped with MDMA. And so that's real numbers.
Yeah, and I would also argue, at least recreational back before it was starting to become a prescription medicine, is that many people who really didn't carry a diagnosis and didn't feel like they had a lot of psychopathology still felt like they benefited from the experience. And, having some honest self-analysis and, doing a thorough inventory can be really helpful for you in general. And also this idea maybe like couples work, family work, where there doesn't have to be an identified patient, but there could still be a de-escalating of a lot of traumatic situations in theory. So there's lots of, there's an endless amount really of places to explore, but this is a medicine that is being proposed to FDA to be approved, and we're all going to hear in August what FDA has to say. And the biggest issue we should talk about, I don't mean to jump the line, but we should talk about the REMS.
We will get to that.
Okay, fine, I'll wait.
Yeah. Wait. Pharmacology?
Oh, right, sure.
Yeah.
So classical psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin seem to work by stimulating one specific receptor that normally the neurohormone serotonin will stimulate. And the psychedelics seem to make you often feel not quite like yourself. You might have a loosening or even dissolving of your ego boundaries. And sometimes you'll get an experience that's transcendent and similar to a religious or mystical experience. Really powerful, impactful experiences that people would count in the top few in their lives. It can be scary though, and there can often be a lot of work afterwards to understand what happened and how it's changed your view about life and reality. MDMA seems to be have less of a tendency to shake things up. You still basically feel like yourself, but a self that's in a good mood, and you've somehow managed to set aside your neuroses and your self-defensiveness, and you can be more honest with yourself and other people. And often you can think about things that would normally upset you and that you would like kind of recoil against, and you think about them in this calm way where you don't really have a big negative response to it. And this can really accelerate therapy, as Julie said. The thing we think is happening here, and it's incompletely understood admittedly, is that MDMA is releasing a couple different monoamine neurotransmitters, really 3, dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. And most of the work is focused on dopamine and serotonin. Dopamine, we think about one of its big roles is tracking and trying to predict what's going to be a good outcome for you. And so when you do something, and if it turns out better than expected, you get this dopamine release. And so drugs that are like ADHD meds that increase dopamine, they tend to make you more optimistic about outcomes, which can be good or bad. Now, it seems like MDMA is layering a lot of serotonin release on top of that. And serotonin is poorly understood, but it seems to be important for kind of changing the stability of ongoing processes in your brain. And one suggestion that people have made is that it switches from kind of automatic responses to more flexible problem solving. And we certainly know that in the nucleus accumbens, which is one of these main dopamine learning centers, if you put serotonin in there, it will cause inputs from regions like the thalamus to be less paid attention to, and there'll be more attention paid to input rather, from the medial prefrontal cortex, from like the front of the brain where emotional information and more flexible information is coming from. So it does seem like the ratio of serotonin to dopamine increases is really important for drugs that feel like MDMA. And you can just measure those in cells and take the ratio and say, yeah, that'll feel like MDMA, or that'll feel like a stimulant, or it'll feel like something else. Now, it's still a little mysterious as to why serotonin should be involved in making you feel less neurotic or more loving or more compassionate. And without going too far from science into poetry, I think it's really telling that serotonin comes to us with mitochondria. We actually get serotonin from this early, like several billion years ago, event that happened where this one unicellular organism ate another one, and then they said, hey, we're really a good team together. And that's the basis of every multicellular organism we have. And so serotonin, before there were even brains, was somehow released and used for individual cells to communicate with other cells. And that's still the use today, which is why in research at Hopkins, Gould Dolan's research, and I think Julie might talk about this in a little bit, hopefully, we have evidence that MDMA can take octopus and still affect them, despite the fact that we diverged from them evolutionarily like 500 years ago. And so what MDMA is tapping into is something really profound and really ancient that speaks to our ability to not just be on our own, but to also be in community with others.
I want to say a little bit more about pharmacology. On the most simplistic, basic level, you can think about serotonin and dopamine as kind of being on a seesaw. And in general, when one is up, the other is down. And if you give, like, I'm a psychiatrist, I prescribe SSRIs, but if you really start giving too much SSRIs, people get kind of apathetic and they don't have any motivation or energy. And then you give a medicine to increase dopamine and things are a little better. And what would be a good antidepressant is an SSRI with a dopamine agonist, but we don't have that. So I end up prescribing like Lexapro, Wellbutrin, and that makes the things kind of balance out. MDMA does increase serotonin and dopamine at the same time. So you get that kind of balance. You get both. But the other thing, yes, there's monoamines, dope. So if somebody has like cocaine or speed, you might notice that they're a little chatty, maybe. They're a little bit awake, and they want to connect. And so you get this sort of methamphetamine base in MDMA where you have that kind of drive to connect and talk, and you're awake and alert and you remember the entire event, which is important. But all that serotonin makes you very kind of comfortable and relaxed, and it's easier to get into problematic areas. But the thing we haven't mentioned yet is my favorite, which is oxytocin. If you check levels of oxytocin after somebody has had MDMA, they are increased. Prolactin is also increased. And what oxytocin is about, if I can again be very simplistic, and please pardon me if you're more complicated at understanding this than I am. I didn't say that very well. That's for Q&A. So oxytocin is a hormone and a neurotransmitter that is involved in bonding and trust and social connection. Very high oxytocin levels are seen in parent-infant bonding, in nursing. Post-orgasmic states are very high oxytocin states, which is why you may actually become emotionally attached to the person that you were hoping to have casual sex with if you happen to have an orgasm. What else? Oh, and high oxytocin states, so MDMA, nursing, orgasm, childbirth, very high. Pregnancy, when your brain is kind of rewiring and reorganizing itself, very high oxytocin state. My last book was called Good Chemistry. It's all about oxytocin and connection. And the bottom line is that fight or flight is adrenaline and cortisol. The opposite of fight or flight, the parasympathetic system, that runs on oxytocin. That is rest, digest, and repair. Oxytocin helps wound repair, it helps repair your body, but it also helps repair your social relationships. If you think about how you act when you're in fight or flight, your social skills aren't that great. The other side is where your social skills really shine. So instead of fighting or running away, which is sympathetic, the parasympathetic is about staying and working your shit out. I said shit for the camera. So
Forgot to beep that out.
And it's about repairing these relationships. So trust, bonding, repairing, connection, that's all oxytocin. And I think that's kind of where the magic is. And that's also what underlies neuroplasticity. Segue.
Well, real quick, before we segue, uncontrolled eye movement also. I think that's fascinating, of like unexplained aspects of the mechanism.
Yeah, one of the
real
things...
quick.
One of the things I'm very interested in is this idea of rolling. If anyone's ever heard of when you take MDMA, it's called rolling. One of the reasons, my understanding of why it's called rolling, is that people can often have these eye movements where their eyes are kind of moving around. You can either get nystagmus, where things are kind of shaky, the eye wiggles. If you've had really good MDMA, you may have the eye wiggles. You also may notice that you don't have as much control over where your eyes are. They're kind of going in their own ways. If you know something about EMDR, that is about eye movements, helping you to access trauma, helping you to process trauma. And I think that the uncontrollable eye movements that happen with MDMA are integral to accessing trauma and processing trauma. And I want somebody to study this.
Yeah, I find that fascinating, and there's still open questions. But neuroplasticity. Now, so Rachel, I want to turn to you, and others can hit on it too, but Gould-Dolin's, critical periods, just, that aspect of the mechanism here.
Yeah, I reached out to Gul. She was a neuroscientist at Johns Hopkins. She just moved to UC Berkeley, and I hit her at a really good time. It was the height of lockdown, and I think she didn't have much to do, so she just talked to me a lot on Zoom. It was very beneficial for me. But I feature her a lot in my book, and I wrote a profile for her about her in Wired. Anyway. Underneath all these brain regions and neurotransmitters and hormones, these differences between this and that psychedelic, Gould's hypothesis is really sort of a mic drop in terms of the mechanistic underpinnings of how it is that all these varied psychedelic drugs seem to work therapeutically. So her findings, which have just been in mice, but they seem to They seem to be replicated in humans by what we know how MDMA-assisted therapy works, point to critical periods. Critical periods are these periods of finite plasticity in which the brain is primed to learn new things. And this is typically in childhood. Think of the ease at which a kid can learn a language compared to me, for example. I can't learn Spanish to save my life. But the brain is open to learning new things, and the purpose of this is to set you up for a lifetime of habits and skills to just be a successful adult. And these critical periods close, and they close for a good reason, which is, you don't want this open malleability, impressionability of a child. It's childhood is a period of like beauty and magic and fantasy, but it's also one of impressionability. So you can have bad actors come in. So the thing about MDMA and other psychedelics that Gould found in these mice trials is that in the right set and setting, it reopens a critical period for social reward learning. So just the benefit that we get from being social species. Mice, like humans, are social species. So if Gould's correct, which evidence points to her being correct, it means that when people are undergoing MDMA-assisted therapy or therapy with another psychedelic in the right set and setting, that is when they're prepared to deal with their trauma, and also in the guidance of a therapist who can help them work through any bumps they encounter along the way. They are in this state of open learning. They can relearn and literally rewire their brains around these maladaptive habits that they've formed around their trauma. And that explains, if Gould's right, why we see such enduring results from just a few one-off sessions with MDMA or with another psychedelic. So really, really powerful stuff. And what's extra fascinating is this set and setting component. So Gould, if her hypothesis is correct, if you tinker with that set and setting, you can reopen different critical periods. So Gould is now testing whether you can reopen a critical period for motor learning. And she's doing this with stroke. So instead of therapy, could you take a stroke patient and pair them with occupational therapy to get them to relearn how to use their limb while on MDMA?
This is not far-fetched in any way. We've been giving amphetamine, speed, to stroke victims forever. So, and we've known that actually amphetamine and methamphetamine are also neuroplastic. So I love Gould, and you did a really great job on her profile. I thought it was great.
Thank you.
I'm glad that you're. Yeah. I also featured her in my book. I think she's fabulous, and her research is really important. And I kind of poo-pooed the octopus thing because I was upset. The octopus is on ecstasy, octopi on ecstasy. Like, that got a lot of press, and the only thing that bothered me about it was that it kind of overshadowed that we had results with the MDMA autism trial, and no one was covering that. And I just was upset about it. But I appreciate that Gould got her.
And so, just to bring it back to mechanisms a little bit, one of the things that's fascinating here is that even though MDMA feels really different than, say, LSD or Ibogaine, they all seem to open this kind of window of enhanced ability to learn things. And the duration of those windows seems to roughly correlate with how long the experience was for each of those compounds. And if we think that there is a window that people experience where we have an enhanced capability to learn, it seems likely that it extends beyond the acute experience, as it does in the mice. And so this might be one of the explanations for why MDMA use out in the world, where people aren't really focused on getting a therapeutic benefit, it often doesn't provide one. And a big part of this might be that people go and have a good time, but then they go back to their ordinary lives where they're getting re-traumatized and are just under the same stressors. And having the space afterwards might be something that could cause people to have much better outcomes. We were in the green room a few minutes ago, and I was talking with the neuroscientists in the last session over, or the next session over, which looked awesome, and I'm sad we're all missing it. But we were speculating about whether you can feel this enhanced neuroplasticity, because there is this afterglow phenomenon that people report with MDMA and many of these psychedelics, where for several days afterwards, you just feel like your brain's working better, you're more optimistic. And so, the science isn't there yet, but there does seem to be a human correlate that may or may not be associated with this phenomenon of this open window.
One of the things I think is interesting about Gould's research is the longer-acting psychedelics give you a longer window of neuroplasticity, and the shorter ones are shorter. And I'd like to remind everybody that ketamine is an extremely short-acting medicine with a much shorter window than MDMA. Than Ibogaine, where Gould says she couldn't even measure where the window closed, because Ibogaine is such a long-acting psychedelic that the window was open for a very long time.
Yeah. So I guess we've talked about a lot of the positives of MDMA. I want to get into a bit of a balanced perspective here, because I think psychedelics are kind of taking on this panacea vibe right now in popular discourse. But Matt, I'll start with you. I mean, at Tactogen, there are things you guys are looking to tweak in developing MDMA-like compounds. I don't know if an appropriate analogy is maybe if MDMA is the iPhone 8, you're looking to develop the iPhone 10. There's utility for both, but so it's sometimes people treat this as a binary debate of one's good, one's bad. I don't think that's the case. But hit on what you guys are trying to re-engineer, let's say, or if there's more nuance to it that I'm not capturing, feel free to voice over that.
Sure, yeah. So MDMA is great and it's going to help a lot of people. But it has a few things that, if you could dial it down, it might be better. One of them is acute cardiovascular effects. And so, maybe 5% of healthy volunteers will get a systolic blood pressure that goes above 180 millimeters mercury. And that's fine if you're young and healthy, but as you get into sort of older and sicker populations, it becomes the kind of thing where you have to keep an eye on. And so in the first 2 clinical trials published with MDMA, we saw, although the average effects were quite fine, we saw these individual participants who had responses that were the kind of things you really need to keep an eye on and do close monitoring of. And that's something that is going to make it a little more expensive and to give this kind of therapy, because you're going to have to screen people really carefully, ensure that they have controlled hypertension, and maybe even take some blood pressures during the session. I don't know. So it turns out that some of those effects are probably contributed to by MDMA metabolites. So MDMA with its 2 oxygens is really easily chewed up and metabolized. And it forms things that continue to have physical effects in the body, even though they don't contribute to the therapeutic effects. So one thing we've played with is taking away one of the oxygens on the molecule and putting a carbon there. And if you do this, the body isn't able to metabolize it as well, so it lasts longer. People often don't need a redose, we think. And some of these kind of off-target effects seem like they don't happen as much. There might be a little better balance of therapeutic effect to cardiovascular effect on average. And then there's some other things. MDMA, as you get into higher doses, it's kind of stoning or sedating, or you get kind of a drunken feeling or something. Like too much serotonin is like, serotonin, we sort of think of it as satiation, like you're full after a big meal. And in fact, serotonin releasers have been used as weight loss drugs, although they're kind of sedating, and so they often add in something else to keep you alert. And so it would be nice if you had something that gave you that therapeutic effect of MDMA, but with a little less of the kind of impairing kind of feelings. So that's another thing we're targeting. And then we're also thinking further down the line about the fact that there is a portion of people out there who, with repeated use, they find that MDMA has diminishing effects. Sasha Shulgin called this loss of magic. And it doesn't seem to happen to everybody. Maybe 40% of people who use MDMA repeatedly. And this is the kind of thing that it doesn't really matter if you're just going to have 3 sessions with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy and get back on the road and to health and have your PTSD taken care of. But if you envision a future where people might want to take an entactogen, an MDMA-like compound with their loved ones, maybe every 2 months, or something like that, and just kind of reconnect and reground and get closer again. That kind of thing is something where you might start to worry about the fact that you're going to get like lesser and lesser effects, maybe need to take a higher and higher dose. And so that's another thing that we're looking at as something that we think we can engineer out of next generation molecules.
And Anne Shulgin was taking it like weekly, right, to write poetry. And after a while, it sort of felt kind of methy in a way, more like speedy. Is that?
Exactly, yeah. So she was taking
never got her magic back.
Yeah, never did.
So a couple things about, one way of thinking about it is cumulative tolerance. That, even if you take it years and years apart, some people think maybe you have like a dozen good experiences in you, but it just feels less good over time. But I hear you say not everybody has that experience. Anne Shulgin eventually arrived at, she thought, about the most frequently you could do it is quarterly, like every 3 months. But that's her personal opinion. And
yeah, there's still a lot of data we need to generate on this. But now focusing on this balanced perspective, and I'm going to collapse a few questions, Julie, just given this is a sign of a good panel of active discussion, but I'm running low on time. REMS, but I think how that ties into I'll bundle it all. Even, we're going to see increased recreational use as this is popularized. Just some of the dangers that folks should be aware of.
I would like
to take proper precaution. And why do we have REMs?
I care a lot about harm reduction. That's like, I identify as a harm reductionist, sort of first and foremost. And first, do no harm is kind of the doctor code. So the first, back in the 80s, 90s, every once in a while, somebody would take MDMA and drink way too much water and have low sodium and seizures that would sometimes lead to coma and death. And so there were situations where like a single tablet but a gallon of water would kill somebody. And I would also argue that a lot of those people were women, and it's possible that they were at a point in their cycle where they were retaining more water than usual. Now we have an issue where a tablet of anything can kill you because we have a poison drug supply in America. And this really keeps me up at night. So that is the biggest risk in the recreational model, is that you will get something that is not MDMA, or it has other things in it, or it has fentanyl in it, and you're not going to live to see the next day. That's the biggest risk. The REMS is FDA saying, okay, if we approve this drug, how are we going to make it safe? And also, how are we going to decrease the risk of diversion, because we want the drug to go to the patient and not anybody else. And so something that has to happen this summer, I believe, is that Lycos and FDA are going to have to get together and sort of bang out how are we going to do this as safely as possible? How are we going to mitigate risk and ensure equity? And that is the biggest question, and I would love to be a fly on the wall in that room, because I care about the outcome very much. Other ways to mitigate risk? Anybody want to
Test your drugs, please. I still have friends who do the finger dip method into the bag. Test your drugs, weigh your drugs. There's a really wonderful nonprofit group in Spain called International Energy Control. You can send them by mail a small sample of your drug, and they'll not only professionally test it in a lab to tell you what is in that sample, but they will tell you the percent purity. So you're not going to get an MDMA tablet that's like 450 milligrams and accidentally overdose yourself that way. And at the same time, you can actually get where you want to go in terms of that role or whatever intention you have for your drug.
Which is amazing, because here in the US, there are organizations that can test your drugs, but they can't tell you how much of any drug is in it. And so like drugsdata.org is a really great resource for knowing what's there, but you won't know how much is in there. Whereas you can go to Energy Control in Spain and get that information.
It used to be, if you just stayed away from the white powders, you were safe. But now the pressed tablets are also unsafe. And even people buying Xanax and Adderall on the street are risking fentanyl exposure. These aren't overdoses. These are poisonings.
Yeah, and I think a tricky thing with fentanyl, too, it's so potent. I mean, a lot of times you have to dissolve the entire product to really accurately test for it, rather than people taking a small sample, which unfortunately adds to the complexity. But one other thing I want to hit on the potential rollout of MDMA as a therapeutic is just bifurcated scheduling. We talked about this as we were prepping. Maybe Matt and Julie can hit on it a bit of, what will that dynamic look like?
Sure. So we've mentioned the term Schedule 1, like drugs like LSD and currently MDMA are considered Schedule 1. That's a system of classifying drugs that was started in 1970, 50 plus years ago. Nixon was president, and it really doesn't make much sense, but we're kind of stuck with it because it's too hard for Congress to do anything functional these days. But Schedule 1 basically means that there's no accepted medical use currently in the US, that it can't be used safely under medical supervision, and that there's a high potential for abuse, although abuse isn't really defined, so they just kind of made up the idea that if it's not medical supervision, it's abuse by definition, But in any case, that's Schedule 1, and MDMA's in it. Now, obviously, if MDMA becomes an approved medicine, it doesn't quite make sense for it to be in a category where it has no approved medical use. And so they're going to move it, but the way regulators like FDA and DEA think is they think about the specific product because for them, like if it's, a tablet with 100 milligrams, it has a different risk profile than if it's a tablet with 10 milligrams or an injectable solution with 100 milligrams. And so what's going to get reclassified is actually just the Lykos prescription product, not MDMA overall. MDMA will remain Schedule 1, and the prescription product will be moved into a different schedule, and it's not yet clear what schedule that will be. Hopefully it's going to be 3 or 4, but there's some possibility it might end up in 2, which is where like Adderall is, and 3 is like where Tylenol with codeine.
Xyrem is a good example. Xyrem has bifurcated scheduling. You may have heard of GHB as a party drug, but it turns out you can also prescribe it to people with narcolepsy if you give it a brand name with X's and Z's in it. So Xyrem is Schedule 3, GHB on the street is Schedule 1. A quick thing about medical versus recreational. I mean, the first thing I will say is that recreational can be therapeutic, right? I mean, I said as much with raving. Many of us have gone with like just a few friends to go camping, and we take mushrooms or we take MDMA, and that is therapeutic. Recreation in and of itself, even if there aren't any drugs, can be therapeutic, right? Being in parasympathetic, being in a playful state, experiencing awe. These are states of deep learning and creativity, and they're therapeutic, full stop. But not as safe as a medical model, because in a medical model, you know what you're taking. So if we had different drug laws, it would be safer, but we don't. So the recreational model is unsafe because you don't know what you're taking, you don't know how much it weighs or what's in it. And if you happen to dance for hours without taking breaks, or if you happen to overhydrate, or overheat, those things are all risky. In the medical model, you're taking 80 or 120 milligrams, you're sitting, maybe you're sipping water, but you're not chugging, you're not dancing for hours, you're not getting overheated, you know what you're taking, you know how much it weighs. So the medical model is simply a less risky way. Adding the psychotherapy puts the advantage, I think, clearly to the medical model. That if you're having MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, you are prepared to do the work, you do the work, and then hopefully, God willing, there are people after to help you process and integrate. Everyone says integration is important. They're right.
One thing to add on Xyrem too, you add the X's and Y's and charge a shit ton of money as well. So Jazz Pharma made a boatload of money off that drug, which is it's fascinating how that happens. And Marinol is another drug too, kind of a medical THC that, the Marinol product has its own scheduling, but obviously THC is still Schedule 1. So I want to kind of close out before we go to audience Q&A with a look to the future. What predictions, what people think kind of the future of MDMA holds. Will this usher in world peace? I think there's anecdotes of where we may need to haircut that a bit. And Rachel, I'll turn to you first.
Sure. One of my closer interview questions when I was reporting my book, which I know a few people here have been asked this by me, is, okay, will MDMA save the world? It's this tongue-in-cheek question, but the answers are kind of interesting. And I'll just share a quick anecdote that I think illustrates the complexity and nuance of this answer. So one of the people I interviewed for my book was the former leader of the white supremacist faction Identity Europa for the Midwest, a guy named Brendan, and he was doxxed. So his identity was released, and he lost his job. He lost all of his friends that weren't white supremacists. His family stopped talking to him. He was in this really low, state, poor guy. And during this time, he couldn't get a job, so he enrolled at a clinical trial at the University of Chicago. He lives in Chicago. And this was just like a way for him to get a little money and spend his time. And he didn't know what the trial was about. He knew he would be given like some sort of substance. It could be a placebo, it could be a drug. And he was given MDMA. He didn't know this, but the trial was for pleasantness of touch on MDMA. So like a lab tech was rubbing his arm with a feather or something, saying, hey, how does this feel? And at some point during this like kind of strange trial, into Brendan's mind popped these thoughts out of seemingly nowhere. Like, wait a minute, what am I doing with my life? Like, what have I done? And as this feather was going up and down his arm, he realized the importance of connection to other people. And then into his mind popped the word love. Like, love is everything. I should be dedicating my life to love. Now, at the surface level, this story of Brendan sounds like, oh my God, we can just like put MDMA in like Donald Trump's Diet Coke and he's gonna like love the world. But, again, there's more nuance to this story than that. Brendan, in a way, if we go back to that set and setting of Gould Dolin's work, Brendan was primed subconsciously to do this work. He had just lost his entire life. His life has been upended. So, yeah, in a way, he spontaneously had healing, but he also was sort of prepared to do this work. And Brendan, today, I've been in touch with him. He's doing really well. He has a job now. He has a girlfriend. And he told me in an email just like a month ago that he's still just dedicating his life to the focus of love. Okay, is Brendan gonna save the world? No, but Brendan is an individual, and individuals can affect positive or negative change, sometimes on a really vast and significant scale. So I think, going back to that question, is MDMA gonna save the world? Probably not, but if enough people have healing, if enough, Brendans have some kind of experience, that can aggregate and turn into a significant effect. So that's my great hope.
And getting back to what Julie said a minute or two ago, it absolutely does depend on that person being ready for this change in some way that maybe we can't tell or measure. I've given MDMA in 2 different studies to someone who believes in eugenics and is basically a white supremacist and hasn't affected their opinions at all. And so
Brendan's friends also said that, or Brendan said, a lot of my friends in the movement take it and they don't.
Yeah.
I'm curious if there were any people of color during the session, like the person with the feather, for instance.
I think it was a pretty white group, but he's trying to work on that. So he says.
As opposed to me blathering on about the future, I would rather do Q&A, to be honest.
All right, let's turn to Q&A. Yeah.
I would suggest, I'll blather briefly. I think it's possible that MDMA has already saved the world. So one of the central places where information about MDMA was spreading in the late 70s, early 80s was Esalen, the birthplace of the human potential movement. And Esalen was crucial in establishing an independent source of communication with the Soviet Union. And so, I don't think it's too much to think that the open groundedness that people at Esalen had allowed them to inject optimism and humanism into key decision makers in the Soviet Union and help them to see that the pathway they were on was the wrong one. And so it's not going to be something that the world is saved and we're all good for the rest of eternity. It's something where each morning people are going to get up, and because of the experiences they've had, they're going to save the world.
I didn't know you could inject optimism and humanism. I've been smoking it. But
All right, I think Q&A. By the way, we love your blathering, Julie. But yeah, probably have time for 2 questions, I'd say. We started a little late.
Go right ahead.
I'm curious, are there dangers with being on an SSRI and then also taking MDMA? Is that too much serotonin?
Matt.
Theoretically, it seems like there might be. Empirically, it doesn't seem like it's much of a problem because the SSRI prevents much of the serotonin release from the MDMA, so they don't really have an additive effect. That being said, though, they might interact in terms of enzymes that metabolize them, and you might end up with much higher concentrations of one or the other that could cause problems.
It's actually a really complicated question that there hasn't been any clinical research, but there's a lot of anecdotal building up. I will tell you about one clinical research with MDMA where we divided all the people that had been given MDMA in the studies, and we divided them into people who had SSRIs and had to come off of them, and people who didn't have SSRIs and didn't have to come off of it. And the people who had to come off the SSRIs did have a blunted response, even though they went off the SSRIs. But we know that people on SSRIs with MDMA are going to have a blunted response. I think that's kind of fair to say.
Yeah, there's been a number of
whether
studies.
You can override that blunted response with more MDMA, I think is an open question. Whether that's effective, whether that's safe, anecdotally, that seems to. I'm hearing that that's what some people are doing. I'm not ready to be like, go ahead and do that. But in general, we haven't seen people have a serotonin syndrome if they're on SSRIs and they take MDMA. But not the best experience, I would say. Hi, Meredith.
Hi. Actually, this is a question for Matt, and we've heard co-founder of a company and the science behind it, but I'm actually curious about your own personal journey with MDMA, how you've come to dedicate your life's energies to this, what benefits you've felt if you've experienced MDMA, how you use it in your day, in your life. Has your family taken MDMA with you? All kinds of questions, personal, that you may or may not want to answer.
We're actually all on MDMA right now, so that
So I went from being like a philosophy major, fairly introverted person to experiencing MDMA as an undergraduate and really seeing in an instant that this was going to be therapeutic for the world and that it was profoundly new and different, not like LSD at all. So I've had some experiences that have really made me a believer in the power of this kind of medicine. That being said, though, since like 98 or so, 96 or so, I've done work in clinical studies where we're giving MDMA to volunteers and trying to understand its effects. And in that context, it seems much better for me to not break the law than to break the law. And so the experiences that I have, I try to focus on novel compounds and taking them in places like Spain or the Netherlands where it's not illegal to do that.
good.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we'll squeeze in one more.
Okay,
Yeah.
one more.
Yeah.
So a lot of people in the culture are talking about Wegovy and Ozempic and these GLP-1 agonists that appear to have more applications beyond treating diabetes and obesity and potentially things like what you, Julie, and you, Matt, mentioned around alcohol use disorder or binge eating disorder. And I'm wondering if maybe this is a two-parter. One is, it seems that both of you have been suggesting that there are lots and lots of different neuropsychiatric application, indications focused on inward suffering that are beyond PTSD. And so is this area of entactogens, is this could it in the future compete with these GLP agonists? And maybe are their mechanisms very different? So is this a good lens to think about entactogens of,
Yes, no. I think the lenses are different, and to me, it's not. For me, it's not a good way to think about it. But I would like some other people to answer. I'm definitely seeing my patients who are on Ozempic and Wegovy, and particularly Mounjaro, which everybody really likes the best, at least for my patients. They are saying things like, I'm picking my cuticles less, I'm biting my cheek less, I'm thinking less about food, I'm drinking less. So there does seem to be like a big impulse control issue happening. But I don't feel like there's a lot of overlap in terms of mechanism of action, but I am not an expert on GLP agonists at all.
I think that there's a lot of commonalities at the level of entactogens are also drugs that we're going to find can help a lot of different indications. And I think it is going to end up being something like impulsivity or something like that with like the Wegovys. And so they do share that parallel. And another thing that they seem to share is that there is such a large demand for these, a large need for them, that they're not really competing products. As each new product comes out, there's probably just going to be more patients that use that product, and you'll see an expansion of the number of people being treated by this category. And I think that's going to be true of these GLP-1 agonists as well as entactogens.
I guess just in terms of my looking at the future, I'm a little nervous because what we have now is increased demand and minimal supply except for underground. And because the drug supply is poison, the danger increases. And also, keep in mind that all these clinical studies, the people going through these trials have been sort of weeded out, like if they have a history of psychosis, if their family has a history of psychosis, or if somebody has like uncontrolled this or that or the other thing, they're not allowed to be in the study. Uncontrolled diabetes, uncontrolled high blood pressure, uncontrolled seizures, you can't be in these studies. So once it's approved and more people are taking it, it's possible, unless everyone's like very strict or there's strict REMS, we're going to see more things that we maybe didn't know were going to be an issue. So there's going to be a bit of a learning curve.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys.
Oh, I have a shameless plug. Sorry, before the...
Go for it.
Yeah. We have a book signing today.
Shamelessly plugging.
Yeah, oxytocin, MDMA. Come by our
I feel
book
so
to-
connected
Oh my
to you. There aren't free samples, but I
Free
will have
hugs,
extended
free
eye
hugs.
contact with each person if that's a little. Yeah, Good Chemistry is my latest, and I Feel Love is Rachel's latest.
What time? What room?
Oh, 2:45 in wherever they have book
I think
signing.
it's-
Third floor, I'm hearing.
This
2:45.
floor, it's like way down the hallway, I think, the book section. So go get your free oxytocin. All right.
Thanks everyone.